Hello, my name is Daniel Sturm. Let me welcome you back to our lectures on urban economics. This is our second lecture, which will be given by Leah Boustan, talking about race, migration, and cities. It's great to see many of you back in our virtual lecture hall. Last week's lecture was watched by almost 5,000 people, both on YouTube and in the webinar. So it's pretty amazing to see you all back here.
I want to start by thanking the UEA for putting together such a fascinating lecture series for the summer, particularly to Fabian and Claire and Daniel, Matt, Don, and Kurt, who all participated in the organization. As we learned last week with Ed, urban economics is often focused on what makes cities productive locations for economic activity, particularly through the density of people and firms in cities through agglomeration economies. Cities can be engines for economic growth. But the question for the lecture today is, do all city residents share equally in this return to urban living? To the extent that urban space is segregated by race, by class, by immigrant status, some of these advantages may not be equally shared. So that will be the topic for today's lecture. To illustrate this point, the image underlying the title slide is a visualization of the city of Chicago. And I chose that city because it's the city that's prototypically used to illustrate the monocentric city model that we learned last week with Ed. And in that model, it's very stylized, but there's only one location where economic activity takes place. It's a core financial or commercial center. And in Chicago, that's not a terrible description of reality. See my cursor here circling on the loop. So this is the area on the edge of the lakefront where much of economic activity takes place in Chicago. So notice the little colored dots here on the map. This is a visualization that was put together by the New York Times in 2015 from 2010 census data. And the colors of the dots represent different population groups. So the green dots here along the lakefront are white households. And the blue dots that are here on the west side and the south side are Black households, and the yellow dots are Hispanic. So you can see that the white population is concentrated very close to employment opportunities, and the Black and Hispanic population of Chicago are further out. Of course, that's not only true in Chicago. This is another one of the New York Times visualizations here of New York City. And we saw some maps of New York with Ed last week. New York has two major employment centers, one down here in the financial district and one here at Midtown. And through most of the island of Manhattan, you see a lot of green dots here. So here's the map key. Green dots are white households. And then in Brooklyn, a large concentration of Black population, especially the part of Brooklyn that's farther away from job opportunities. And here in Queens, we have a mixture of Asian and Hispanic population. So my goals for today, so we have two different sections of the lecture. The first part, before we pause for questions, we're going to talk about some of this segregation data, the trends over time in the images that I was showing you. Move beyond just looking at two cities, of course, to look at data for the US as a whole. And then think about what economics has to say about the underlying causes of this segregation. And then after the break, we'll talk about the economic consequences of separation in space, looking at Black-white segregation and also immigrant enclaves. Typically, those two literatures are not necessarily discussed together, and think about what might be fruitful in discussing those two topics under the same framework. But I have to say that in preparing these for discussing these topics today, it was impossible for me to ignore the news of recent weeks and months. First, in March, with the spread of the coronavirus, it became very quickly clear that COVID risk was not equally shared by all in the US, but that Black Americans were more at risk of contracting and dying from COVID. And then in late May, the nation and the world learned about the killing of George Floyd by a police officer in Minneapolis. And we were sickened and angered by what we saw, and many of us did take to the streets. So we're living right now through urban history. We're studying urban areas as urban economists, but we're also living this history together. So before we spend time today learning about what economics has to say about segregation, I want to start by taking a minute of silent reflection to honor the memory of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the many other victims of police brutality. Thank you all so much for participating with me in this moment of silence. I want to say that as social scientists, we aim to study the forces of segregation with rigorous methods, but I don't want the scientific distance to prevent us from being engaged in the world and moved by the individual stories. Let me shift to looking at some of the trends in segregation over time. Um, we started the lecture with snapshots of two cities, New York and Chicago, and some questions will naturally emerge from this comparison. How do these two cities compare to other metropolitan areas around the country? And how does the time period 2010 compare to the longer history of segregation in the US? Are we at a high point or a low point of segregation today? Most measures of segregation are defined by separation across space of two groups. And so you have to start by choosing which groups you want to look at. So the image that I'm showing you here is from a Glaser and Vigdor report from 2012, looking at the 2010 census. And the choice that they made is to look at Black, non-Black segregation. So this fully partitions the population in the US, and non-Black includes whites, many Hispanics who select white or other race, Asians, and Native Americans. And the answer to the question is that 2010 is not at all the high point of segregation in US history. In fact, that dubious designation goes to the year 1970 here, with segregation first increasing from 1890 to 1970, and then since then declining. However, despite the fact that we're in a period now of declining segregation, it's still the case that segregation levels between Blacks and non-Blacks are incredibly high, higher than for most other groups. To give you a sense of that magnitude for the levels, if you look at the top line, this is the dissimilarity index. And roughly what this is telling us is how many Black residents would need to move from their current neighborhood to another neighborhood in the same metropolitan area in order that all local neighborhoods reflected the demographics of the metro as a whole. And the answer is that even today, even though segregation's been declining, 55% of Black households would have to move somewhere else in order for each neighborhood to be a little microcosm of the metropolitan area as a whole. The lower line here is the isolation index, and that's telling us the share of the average Black resident's neighborhood that is Black. And that share is over 30%. This is going to be a weighted average of some Black households that are living in neighborhoods that are 95% white, and some Black households that are living in neighborhoods that are 80 or 90% Black. But on average, the typical Black resident is living in a neighborhood that is 30% Black. Just a few notes on choices that you have to make if you want to measure segregation. First, you have to think about two units of geography: the large unit, so the city or the metro as a whole, and the smaller unit, the neighborhood that you'll compare to the larger metro area. So you could look at central cities. Here, Glaser and Vigdor are looking at metro and micropolitan areas for their larger housing market. At the neighborhood level, from 1940 onward, we've had census tracts, which are groups of around 4,000 households. But before 1940, the census had a different geography called census wards. And so this series is putting together two different units. If you're interested in getting even further below the level of the neighborhood, it could be that you're living in a neighborhood of 4,000 people, but your block, your next door neighbors could be of your own race or a different race. Those who are interested can check out the paper cited here at the bottom of the list by Logan and Parman. came out in the Journal of Economic History in 2017, looking at who is enumerated on your census manuscript page next to you. Those would be your next door neighbors. So it's a very local, individual level of segregation. And we'll get back to some of these data issues over the course of the lecture, but essentially the census becomes publicly available 72 years after the survey is taken. And so we would not know for today who is my next door neighbor on a census manuscript page. And the census is also not even taken by manuscript form anymore. So this is a measure that we can use for looking at historical analysis. So as I mentioned, Black, non-Black segregation is higher than for other groups. So I wanted to illustrate that quickly here on this slide, taking some data from sociologists, Iceland and Scoplatini. Now the choice that they made is a bit different. It's not Black, non-Black, but they're looking at Black, native-born, non-Hispanic, white segregation. And so the levels are going to be a bit different. They're actually a bit higher than what we would see in the Glaser-Vigdor series. This data is for the year 2000. And for the year 2000, Glaser and Vigdor find a level of dissimilarity of around 0.6, meaning that 60% of Blacks would have to move neighborhood. For Black, native-born, non-white, non-Hispanic white segregation, that level is 0.67. So it's higher. And that tells us that some of the integration that's been going on is going on not between Blacks and non-Hispanic whites, but actually between Blacks and other groups in the non-Black category. So Blacks and Hispanics, Blacks and Asians, and so on. But what we can see with this comparison is that the degree of dissimilarity is much higher for Blacks than for these other groups. Now, all of the comparison points are the same on the right-hand side of the slash marks, but the segregated group is different as you go down the rows. So you can look at Blacks here in the top row, foreign-born, Hispanic, and then foreign-born Hispanic. And for each of these cases, we see much lower levels of dissimilarity than for Blacks and whites. And so for that reason, I'm going to focus primarily on Black-white or Black-non-Black segregation for much of the lecture today. And then at the end, I'm going to circle back around to talking about immigrant enclaves. Okay, so let's get into talking about the causes of segregation. And this is a framework that I'm taking from a handbook chapter of mine, if you have interest in looking in more detail. So why does segregation exist? Because segregation is defined as two groups that are located at different places in space, it must be that at least one of these groups does not want to live near the other group and is willing to therefore pay more to live separately or take costly actions to preserve their neighborhood and keep another group out. But that very abstract idea of segregation doesn't tell us who group that's willing to pay more, who is the group that's taking these costly actions. And it could be group A or it could be group B. And so when we put this in the context of Black-white segregation, we can classify these potential causes into three categories. The first is self-segregation. It could be that the members of the minority group prefer to live near each other. And so they're willing to pay more and to live in an enclave of their own. Alternatively, it could be that the majority group is taking actions to live separate from the minority. And so here it could be that whites are taking costly actions to exclude Blacks, and we call that collective exclusion, or that whites are choosing to leave integrated neighborhoods or jurisdictions, and we call that white flight. Within economics, there's not very much written about the first potential cause of segregation, potential self-segregation of the Black population. With the exception of a paper by Joel Waldfogel about local private goods. So local private goods are things like restaurants and shops and maybe churches and community centers. So places where the local population will shop and do commerce. And it could be that the Black population has a different set of preferences for these restaurants and so on than the white population. And that's what the Waldvogel paper is about. That might give rise to self-segregation. But besides this paper, there's been little discussion of this topic in economics. And this is probably because there's been work done on the topic in sociology and in public policy. And most of the papers reject this hypothesis when it comes to Black-white segregation. So I have some of the references down at the bottom of the screen here. And what these papers do is they use a stated preference approach rather than a revealed preference approach. They take subjects into a lab setting and they show them hypothetical neighborhoods. This is a strategy that's been going on since the 70s, and then as time goes on, these studies do get more sophisticated. They show subjects like little video clips of constructed neighborhoods where they have actors playing the neighbors of different races, and they ask, which neighborhood do you want to live in? And it's the case that Black respondents select more integrated neighborhoods in these studies than the typical Black resident lives in. So they might select neighborhoods that are 50-50 Black and white, whereas many Blacks live in neighborhoods that are 75 or 80% Black. And so through these stated preference approaches, sociologists have concluded that in the case of Black-white segregation, we can take the hypothesis of self-segregation off the table. When we get to immigrant enclaves, there's actually still quite a very active discussion of self-segregation. Is it the case that immigrants choose to live near other immigrants? Now, that leaves two hypotheses still on the table: collective exclusion and white flight. And so we're going to consider each one of these in turn. The answer is that both of these can be going on, and they can be going on to different degree at different points in history. So I don't mean to pose these as mutually exclusive possibilities. And when we think about collective exclusion, it's really quite a wide range of activities. It could be direct actions by neighbors that could be extra legal, so harassment and violence against prospective Black neighbors. And this has happened quite a bit through US history, where a Black family moves in and local white families threaten to burn the house down or picket the house, stand outside and protest. Or collective exclusion could be through means that were legal at the time. So for example, restrictive covenants. So the deed of sale for a house might explicitly say this house can never be transferred to a Black household. These covenants were quite common in the US until they were invalidated by the Supreme Court in the late 1940s. Could be the actions of real estate agents to steer families away from white neighborhoods, which just raises the cost of a Black family finding a house in an integrated neighborhood, as well as efforts from mortgage lending institutions to restrict access to credit. So what do we know about collective exclusion versus white flight? Now, as is common for us as economists, the first place that we're going to turn to distinguish between hypotheses of the world is to prices. And so we can learn about these two possibilities from housing prices. And this was an important insight from a seminal paper in this literature by Cutler, Glaser, and Vigdor. And they have a model that's very stripped down, where a city has two neighborhoods, and each one has a fixed housing supply. And then Black families and white families are choosing where to live between these two. In a world of collective exclusion, Blacks can move to the white neighborhood, but to do so, they pay a very high cost. So they might have someone sitting outside their house protesting, for example. And this will effectively restrict the housing supply that's available for Black families. And when housing supply is restricted, housing prices that Black families pay will be higher. Alternatively, if we're in a world of white flight, white families could choose to move to either neighborhood. They always have the option of moving to the Black neighborhood, but they choose not to. They choose to voluntarily restrict those sets of units from their housing supply set. And so therefore, white families will pay more for housing. And the Cutler et al. Paper does find that segregation is associated with differences in housing prices between Blacks and whites, and that at mid-century, in the mid-20th century, Blacks paid more for housing in segregated cities, and today whites pay more for housing. So if we think about the sweep of history that we saw in this time series, as segregation is ramping up, that might be a world of collective exclusion. As segregation is maintained in the mid to late part of the 20th century, that might be a world of white flight. So this is a very powerful framework, but I also want to point out a caveat from Bayer, Ferreira, and Macmillan that crucially, this framework depends on assumptions that we make about housing supply. So notice that I said that there's two neighborhoods and they each have fixed housing supply in the Cutler et al. Model. We could have a sorting equilibrium arise without any housing price gaps at all if there's a responsive construction sector. So let's say whites want to flee from a Black neighborhood in the center city and move to a white neighborhood in the suburbs. Initially, there won't be many housing units there, but as the demand is shown for living in the suburbs, there'll be new construction and eventually housing price gaps will no longer be present. So housing supply elasticities are key to this exercise, and I want to come back to that in a moment, but I'll just sort of flag that for now. Inspired by this Cutler et al. Contribution, there's an interesting set of new papers studying collective exclusion. These papers do focus on the mid part of the 20th century, sort of that comes out of both what we know from the history and what we can see from the price data as to when collective exclusion was probably most salient. There's still a lot more work to be done in this area, so I'll also highlight where additional work could be done. So one recent paper that has looked at collective exclusion is by Aronson, Hartley, and Mazumder, and I'll show you some of those results on the next slide. That paper is focused on the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC. And this was an institution that was established in 1933 as part of the New Deal in the depths of the Depression, when many households were at risk of foreclosure on their mortgage. And so the HOLC formed to purchase troubled mortgages from private lenders, and this was a government entity. And so in order to do that, the HOLC drew lending maps of many large cities in the US to say, well, okay, if we see a troubled mortgage, should we buy this? Is this a risk that's worth taking that maybe right now the household is struggling, but within 5 or 6 years, they'll probably recover. So they classified different neighborhoods by color. Here, this is a map of Philadelphia. And you can see the outlying suburbs are classified as blue, and some of the downtown area is on the outskirts in the north as yellow, and then in the core city is red. And this is where the term redlining comes from these maps. And the blue areas are sort of designated as being good risks to take based on different attributes of the housing stock, but also of the population of the area. So an area that was racially diverse was more likely to be classified as yellow or red. And the question in the Aronson paper, at Aronson et al., is do these maps themselves contribute to the segregation that we see emerging in the 30s and 40s, and do they continue to have effects today? Or alternatively, it could be that these maps are just reinforcing what was already in place. It could be that the private lenders were already envisioning the city in exactly this way. They were already taking race into account, and so the HOLC maps just reified what was already on the ground. And in that case, the federal government was less responsible for the ensuing segregation. And so what Aronson et al. Find is that the HOLC maps did contribute to neighborhood segregation, and that segregation continues till today. And so I'm going to illustrate this in one of the figures that come from their paper. This is a pretty complex figure, so I'm going to go step by step. It looks pretty innocuous, but there's actually a lot underlying it. Okay, so we're going to start by just thinking about the blue line here. And the blue line is already showing us a difference in Black population share. Okay, so the outcome on the y-axis is share African American at the neighborhood level. And it's a difference between red and yellow areas. So if you think about the Philadelphia case, it would be like, let's say in this K zone over here, it would be this region right here where they're comparing. Black population share close to the boundary between red and yellow. And they zero in on housing units that are within 1/4 mile of the boundary. And what they find is that the red areas were already more racially diverse starting in 1910 and actually became more racially diverse than the neighboring areas from 1920 to 30. This is before HOLC got involved. So it sort of looks in this case with just the blue line like the HOLC maps are just sort of continuing a trend that's already taking place, that they're dividing areas that are becoming more Black over time. Why are they becoming Black over time? Well, that is we're going to get into with the Great Black Migration from the South. So this is a period where cities like Philadelphia started out, say 3 or 4% Black, and then over time became close to 50% Black. So there's a lot of inflow over this period. So how are we going to focus in on the role of the HOLC? The HOLC takes place around 1933. We only have decadal data here from the census, so we would be comparing 1930 to 1940. If we're looking at the actual boundaries, it looks like there's already a trend going on. So what Aronson et al. Do is they find some comparison areas. Areas that are very similar to this boundary here in area K based on the underlying attributes of the blocks, but were not classified as a boundary zone by HOLC. So think about, let's say, like the area within the red zone. Maybe there's a little cluster right here of houses that are newer, that are larger, that have a larger white population. And that little cluster looks much more like the yellow areas, but it's small. So it was not actually used to designate a boundary zone. What if we created placebo boundaries there, though, and said, okay, these are areas that look very much like the red-yellow boundary? Well, in that case, from 1910 to 1930, there's a very similar trend for these differences in racial composition along these placebo boundaries. And then after the HOLC, these areas start to diverge so that the placebo boundaries actually converge in racial composition, so initially one side was Blacker than the other, but eventually the neighborhood fills in and the racial composition looks similar on both sides. For the areas that did in fact get HOLC designation, those areas continue to diverge in racial composition. And so from this, Aronson et al. Conclude that the HOLC maps did have an independent effect on segregating Black families from white families. And why would Black families move to the red side of the boundary over time? Primarily, the idea is that they had fewer outside options. So this is how we know we're in the world of collective exclusion. If there are few neighborhoods available to them, and there are neighborhoods that have a disadvantage imposed upon them, and that disadvantage is the inability to get access to credit, then those are the neighborhoods that Black families were able to access. So there's much more that we could do on topics of collective exclusion in economics. And just listing a few of the topics here. There's been, of course, a bit of work done on each of these, but not too much. Okay, so I'm going to turn now from collective exclusion to thinking about white flight. From what we know from Cutler et al., white flight is more responsible for maintaining segregation today than is collective exclusion, though both could still be at work in the housing market. And so what can economics tell us about the forces that generate white flight? And that is white households willing to pay more to move to a neighborhood that is majority white. So I'm going to put together a simple framework that is can think of as based on Rosen-Roback techniques that we talked about with Ed last week. The Rosen-Roback model usually has many metropolitan areas within a country, and households can choose which of these metropolitan areas to move to. But in this case, we don't need to model all of the metro areas. We can focus in on one location and then think about the other metropolitan areas as this outside option. And so here we're thinking about a northern city that is initially all white, which is historically not doing too much disservice to the history because up until certainly 1910 and then even up till around 1940, many northern cities were vast majority white. And in this area, white households can always choose to move out and go elsewhere in the country. And so that pins down what the utility level must be for households in that center city. And that utility is here as a U lower bar on the right-hand side of the equation. But if a household chooses to stay in the center city as opposed to moving elsewhere, they have a utility that is determined by the local housing prices, the Black population share in the city, and then this demand shifter, Z. Of course, nobody likes expensive housing, so utility is falling in housing prices. And the demand shifter is set to be positively affecting utility, so it's some kind of amenity or productivity term. And then B, the Black population share. At the moment, we'll start thinking about a case where whites actually don't have any preference over racial composition. Of course, this is not historically accurate. So the reason why we do this is to think about what would happen when Black population moves into a city, even absent racial animus. And then we will add on to the model the case where whites might worry about the racial composition of their area. Initially, we think about all Blacks living in the South, and so their utility is set by this S lower bar, but they can choose to move to the North when this equation suggests that that would be optimal for them. So either when wages fall in the South or when the Z term, for example, increases, and that might draw Black migrants in. So we're thinking about a world of the Great Black Migration, which is one of the largest demographic events in US history, with 7 million Black migrants moving from the South to northern and western cities. And this is a graph just of the decadal timing of the Great Black Migration taken from my book. And you can see there's a first wave of migration around World War I that then diminishes during the Great Depression and picks back up again during World War II. So the decades of 1940, 1950, and 1960 saw very large inflows of Black migrants to northern cities. And that's what I'll focus on in terms of the empirical work that I'll show you is this era 1940 to 70. In more recent years, there's actually been a net Black migration to the South. And part of sort of the general move to Sunbelt cities. Okay, so what happens to this city when Black migrants move in? First, like I said, we need to think carefully about housing supply and housing supply elasticities. And so in a very simple framework, if population moves into a city, then the housing construction sector will have an incentive to build new units. New people move in, housing prices go up in the very short run. That triggers the housing construction sector to build new units and housing prices come back down. And so then prices would be pinned to construction costs. So let's let the construction costs equal C. But in a more realistic framework, in the short run, housing prices will be a function of population. And that is because there will be limited ability of the construction sector to respond. And on the flip side, when people move out, housing units do not immediately disappear. So if we can think about this in two zones, what happens when prices are above construction costs? So this is when new people move in, there's new demand for the city. Does the construction sector respond perfectly? Well, that's going to depend on the elasticity of housing supply. So depending on that parameter, maybe it's not perfect because there are zoning regulations in the city, which makes it impossible to build new units perfectly for each new resident. Now, on the flip side, if people move out and prices fall below construction cost in the short run, then of course no new construction will occur. But housing units do not immediately get taken out of circulation. Just because demand falls, it doesn't mean that the units that are no longer occupied disappear. And so this will depend on how quickly housing prices depreciate. So in both of these zones, both when prices are above construction cost and when they're below, there's not going to be perfect response right away. And so in the short run, in this framework, housing prices will be a function of population. And this is sort of borrowing from a housing supply function specified in Glaser and Jerko. Okay, so then what happens when Black migrants move in? Let's say Southern wages decline, Black population moves into the city. Well, before this migration took place, the city was already in long run equilibrium. So with the existing population that was all white, the equilibrium price, which is a function of population for the reason I just explained, will be construction cost. And at that price equal to C, white residents were indifferent between living in that city and moving elsewhere. So, or the marginal white resident was indifferent. So now we have a perturbation of that equilibrium with new migration moving in, and that will, in the short run, increase prices. And so some whites will leave the city for that reason. How many whites are leaving the city when you have B new Black migrants moving in? Well, the new population is W, the old white population, plus B. And we know that at population W, prices return to construction cost. So exactly B whites must leave when Black population moves in, under the assumption that I said we were going to start with, that whites do not have a preference over racial composition. So we do this in order to get a benchmark prediction, and we see the prediction right here, that if whites have no preference over racial composition, then there will be white departures when Black population moves in, but simply because these are new people, not because they're new Black people. And so there will be one-for-one departures from the city. So this is something we can test in the data. We can ask, when Black population moves in during this 1940 to 70 period, how many whites leave? Is it 1-for-1 or is it more? If some white households dislike Black residents living in the city, then even after B white residents leave and prices return eventually to P star, then white residents will still, there will be a resident on the margin who still strictly prefers to leave the city. And so in order to restore equilibrium, it must be that more than B white residents leave. So that is going to be a prediction that we can test. And then in that case, if more than B residents leave, we think that at least in the short run, prices will fall below P star because we won't be down back to population at the old level of W, will actually be below that. Okay, so what do we see when we test this in the data? So here, this is a table from a paper of mine where I'm stacking 3 decades of data, 1940s, 50s, and 60s, for around 100 center cities, 70 or so center cities. And what we're looking at is what happens when one new Black resident moves in. So the key right-hand side variable is number of Black entrants, and then the outcome variable is number of whites that leave. And what we see is that even if we're just looking at the correlation between Black arrivals and white departures, that correlation is 2-for-1. So for every one Black migrant that moves in, there's 2 white residents that leave. Now, they don't necessarily go to the suburbs of that metro. They may go somewhere else in the country, but we know that they've left that center city. And so that is an indication that there is white flight going on above and beyond just a housing market interaction, but actually because of white distaste for living near Blacks. And the paper goes into thinking about the causality. Why do Black migrants move into a place in the first place? Well, remember, I said one reason is that wages might fall in the South. And that should be something that's it's an exogenous force to what's going on in the city in question. But another possibility is that the Z term in that city increases, and that draws migrants in. And in that case, we might be worried that places that are receiving Black migrants have some local change going on. And so I put together a shift share instrument that's similar and sort of inspired by the a David Card instrument for international immigration from the Card 2001 Journal of Labor Economics paper. And the idea there is that every northern or western city that has Black population has a different composition in terms of their states of birth. Some have a lot of migrants coming from Louisiana and Texas. Some have a lot of migrants coming from North Carolina and Virginia. And then when those southern states have economic change, that's going to push migrants to certain locations in the north. And that's that column on the right-hand side with the instrument. But instrumenting does not really change the pattern that we have 2-for-1 departures. So another thing we expect if there's white flight is that when the Black population share increases, then housing prices should fall. And that's what we see. But then in the right-hand side of this table, also separate metropolitan areas into high growth and low growth metro areas. And the reason why is that, remember, we expect housing prices to fall below construction costs temporarily, but that as housing units depreciate and disappear, then housing prices should come back to the previous level. It's very hard for housing units to depreciate in a low growth or stagnating metro where people are moving out and we just have to wait for the housing units to kind of deteriorate over time. It's easier in a high growth metro area where in order to reduce the number of units in a relative sense, you just simply have to slow down on new. Yeah, okay, I could see that I was frozen. So what I was just saying is, okay.
It seems to work again. Great now, Leah.
It's working. Okay. All right. Very good. Okay. So what I was saying was that it's easier for housing units to depreciate in high growth areas because what you simply need to do is slow down on new construction. Whereas in low growth areas, you have to wait for the existing units to depreciate. And indeed, we see that the housing price responses are stronger in low growth areas. So I also want to highlight some new work by Allison Schertzer and Randy Walsh. They're using a very similar research design and they're looking at this earlier period, 1900 to 30, which I had said, well, there's a lot of collective exclusion going on during that period, but there's also white flight. And so these two things kind of mix and they occur at the same time. What's nice about the Schertzer and Walsh paper is that they're actually able to look at Black entrants into your neighborhood, not just into your center city. So because they have that complete count census data that I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, they're able to get down to a very small geographic unit and see, well, okay, in Chicago, there's a lot of neighborhoods that have Black population, but they don't all have Black population that hail from the same southern state. So if you have an area in Chicago that has a lot of residents that originally were born in Louisiana and another area with residents that were born in Mississippi, they're not going to receive inflows at the same time. And they're able to take advantage of that to see that when Black migrants move into your neighborhood in per se, you see around 2 to 3 white departures. Putting those magnitudes together, it suggests that a lot of what I was finding in my paper at the city level was probably due to neighborhood forces, probably due to concerns that white households had about a Black family moving next door. Another alternative possibility is, given how segregated cities were at the time, it could be that white residents may not have any Blacks moving next door, may not even have a feeling like Black families would ever move next door. If you think about the map I showed you of Chicago with the very green areas on the north side, those areas were insulated from Black arrivals, but still it could be the case that white families choose to leave and move to the neighboring suburb because they're concerned about local public goods that need to be decided at the municipal level. So this is something that I've also looked at in the mid part of the 20th century. And I ended up finding that there's actually not much scope for this hypothesis until you get to the era of school desegregation. And so what I'm doing, if you think about the Chicago map, is think about the blocks that are just on the very edge of Chicago on the north side, right before the suburbs begin. So the boundary between Chicago and Evanston, let's say. Those areas are 99% white at the time, but Chicago as a whole was becoming substantially Black, and Evanston was less so, much less so. It does look like residents move from the Chicago side of the border to the Evanston side, and that's just one example, of course. We're looking at multiple cities when the city becomes higher in Black population share. But this is entirely due to the fact that Black entrants were poorer than the average Chicago resident at the time. If you have inflows into your city of other poor groups, the same type of phenomenon takes place. So what seems to be going on is that there is some white departures that come from concerns about living in a poorer jurisdiction and the need to pay higher property taxes, maybe to cross-subsidize poor neighborhoods. But the racial component is not as important in that type of suburban flight until we get to school desegregation. So this is the last thing that I'll say before we pause for questions. The northern and western cities that we've been talking about do not desegregate their schools until the 1970s. So there was some action taken in the South in the 60s because Southern schools were segregated by law. There was a designated white school and a designated Black school. Northern cities were also very segregated in practice, but they did not have official laws that indicated that schools must be separate. And so the key Supreme Court decision that drew in northern cities was Keyes versus Denver. And there, I'll just quote from Justice Brennan, who wrote the decision, and he said, although there were no official laws supporting segregation in Denver, quote, the school board, through its actions over a period of years, intentionally created and maintained the segregated character of the core city schools. And so through those actions that were not officially segregation in law, but created segregation on the ground, northern cities did become court-ordered desegregation in the 1970s. Now, how does this relate to cities and suburbs? Well, it turns out that the suburbs were exempted from these court orders. And that pertains to the second Supreme Court case that I mentioned here, the 1974 Milliken versus Bradley, where this case determines what does it mean for a school district to be segregated. The suburbs were worried, wait a second, with the Keyes decision, is it the case that we are also going to have to join in to these court orders? And the answer was no, because segregation was determined at a school district level. If you had a separate school district, then you would be analyzed on your own. And how can you be a segregated district? Only if your local schools do not reflect the demographics of the district as a whole. So if your district is entirely white and your schools are all entirely white, then you are considered not to be segregated because each school reflects the demographics of the district. What we know from this era comes from a vocal minority that was active in protesting these city level desegregation orders. And these are pictures from Boston, which has become iconic in thinking about protests against desegregation. But the question is, how broadly felt were these sentiments, and can the imposition of desegregation orders explain continued white flight? Here is a situation where I found that on the city-suburban borders, there does seem to be a role for these local public goods decisions in driving continued white flight. So what I'm looking at here is not the number of departures from a neighborhood, which is what we've been talking about up until this point. Instead, I'm looking at housing prices as an outcome. And in the first column here, we're looking at around 25 boundaries between cities that were forced to desegregate in the 70s and their neighboring suburbs that were not. In the middle column, we have similar boundaries between cities and suburbs, but these were for cities that did not go under court order. Okay, so what we see is before the court orders were put in place in 1970, the city side of the border already had lower housing prices. So that's what we're looking at in each one of these cells is a gap between a city price and the neighboring suburb price just across the border. So they already had housing prices that were 3 to 5% lower in 1970. So you can't just simply compare a boundary and make inferences from that. You need to look at the changes over time after these court orders were put in place. And so for the areas where the court orders were established, the housing price gap increased from 5% to 10% over that decade, whereas they did not change in the comparison boundaries. And so from that, I infer that from the housing price evidence, that, as you remember, is sort of the flip side of white departures. As demand for living on the city side of the border declines, as households move out, that's how housing prices fall. And so with some heroic assumptions, we could take these housing price changes and try to back out how much of white flight was driven by the desegregation orders. So I'm going to pause here for questions. Like I said to the organizers, I'm going to have some questions now for around 10 minutes and then a break. The second part of the lecture is shorter. So I think it's, it's okay that it's not 11:45 or 11:50. It's actually 11:57. So I think we'll have time for 10 minutes of questions now.